Their wedding, maid of honor stood up and said she's pregnant with her billionaire husband's child. Part 2. The wedding did not collapse because of infidelity. It collapsed because truth waited too long to introduce itself, and by the time it did, everyone was already standing in the wrong story. Most people remember the sound first, not shouting, not accusation, the sudden absence of music, the uncomfortable movement of chairs, the way laughter ended so abruptly it felt misplaced. A room full of people realized at the same moment that something permanent had just occurred. But because uncertainty had taken the microphone, and once uncertainty steps forward in public, it speaks louder than truth ever could. The ring made a sound too small for its meaning. That single noise carried more weight than every word spoken at the altar was prepared to hold. People didn't need explanations after that. The sound alone felt conclusive, and what they believed they saw became the version they took home with them. Public moments are deceptive. They make endings look complete when they're not. They give strangers the comfort of closure while leaving the people involved carrying unanswered questions. The crowd that night went home believing they understood everything. They didn't see what followed, because consequences rarely stay where witnesses gather. They follow people home instead. Natalie did not scream. She didn't plead. She didn't fall apart the way people expect women to when their lives change suddenly. She stood still, blinking, slowly, as if her mind was testing whether this was real or just a moment that would correct itself. It didn't. That stillness wasn't strength yet. It was shock learning how to breathe. No one asked Natalie what she understood. No one checked what she knew. The room decided for her. Assumptions were formed, judgments passed, conclusions locked into place, and in that process her right to process privately disappeared. Something precious was taken that night. Not love, but choice. Richie moved toward her instinctively, not with explanations ready, not with defenses rehearsed. He knew something was wrong, but knowing that did not stop the room from believing otherwise. Intent could not outrun perception anymore. There had been a moment earlier, weeks earlier, where silence felt safer than truth. It felt kinder, protective, temporary. But silence does not announce when it is overstayed. It simply waits until it costs more than honesty ever would have. That cost arrived at the altar. Fear does not plan carefully. It waits until stakes are highest, then speaks without concern for aftermath. The words said that night were not spoken with strategy. They were spoken with desperation. And desperation does not pause to consider who will be harmed in the process. It only knows one goal: end the feeling immediately. By the time people reached their cars, the story had already settled. They didn't think in timelines. They didn't verify details. They carried impressions instead. And impressions, once formed publicly, resist correction stubbornly. Truth does not travel as fast as shock. This story is not here to soften anyone's discomfort. It is not here to excuse decisions or erase consequences. It exists because moments like that are often remembered incorrectly, not out of malice, but because people rarely stay behind long enough to learn the truth. Understanding what actually happened doesn't make the pain disappear, but it places responsibility where it belongs. Once the facts are known, the questions change. Not who betrayed whom, but who decided who deserved the truth, and when. Once that becomes clear, this stops being a story about scandal. It becomes a story about choice, fear, and delayed honesty. After the lights dimmed and guests left, no resolution walked out with them. There was only quiet. Quiet homes, quiet drives, quiet rooms where shock finally had space to turn into something heavier. That is where the real damage began. This is not a story about a ruined wedding. It is about how quickly trust can fracture when truth waits too long to introduce itself. It is about how silence can mean protection one day and harm the next. And it is about how public moments rarely tell the full story. If you're listening now, stay. Not for answers that arrive cleanly, but for understanding that arrives honestly. Because what happens after the crowd leaves is where meaning lives, and what unfolds next will reframe everything you think you already know. Welcome to Mr. Williams' Story Time. If you're ready to hear the story as it truly happened, follow along and subscribe to the channel. The drive away from the venue felt longer than it actually was. Natalie sat in the back seat, staring straight ahead, watching familiar roads slide past without recognition. Streetlights turned on one by one, each glow briefly filling the car before falling away again, like moments she couldn't hold on to long enough to understand. No one spoke. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt necessary. Her body remained upright, shoulders squared, hands folded in her lap, as if posture alone might prevent everything from collapsing further. She focused on breathing evenly, counting each inhale and exhale so her mind wouldn't drift back to the sound of the room going quiet all at once. The car moved steadily forward. Life did not pause. The dress weighed more than she expected. It pressed against her legs, heavy with layers she had once loved for how soft they felt against her skin. Now each fold seemed to pull downward, as if the fabric itself recognized that it no longer belonged to the future she had imagined. She adjusted it slightly, then stopped. Moving it felt wrong, like disturbing evidence she wasn't ready to examine yet. Her fingers curled around the edge of the material, nails catching lightly in the lace. The sensation grounded her, kept her present in the unfamiliar reality where this dress was no longer a symbol of beginning, but of interruption. She didn't cry. She didn't think yet. She simply held the weight. Her parents' house came into view without announcement. The porch light was already on, casting a familiar glow that usually meant warmth, routine, safety. Natalie hesitated for half a second before the car stopped completely. The sight of the front door suddenly intimidating in a way it never had been before. Crossing that threshold meant accepting something had changed. Her mother opened the door quietly. No questions followed, no rushed reassurances. Her father stepped aside to make space, allowing Natalie to enter on her own terms. Inside, the house felt smaller than she remembered. The air was still, unmoving, as though the rooms themselves were waiting for instruction. Natalie walked slowly down the hallway, heels clicking softly against the floor, the sound oddly loud in the absence of conversation. She passed framed photos on the wall, birthdays, graduations, smiling faces paused in time. None of them recognized the version of her standing there now. She didn't stop to look closely, she just kept walking. Her childhood bedroom was exactly the same pale walls, same dresser, same bookshelf holding novels she hadn't touched in years. The bedspread had been straightened earlier that day, prepared with the quiet hope that this visit would be temporary. Natalie stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain how to enter the room dressed as someone she wasn't anymore. She stepped inside anyway. The door remained open. No one followed her. A framed photograph sat on the dresser. Two girls, arms around each other, laughing at nothing in particular, unaware of how complicated life would become. Natalie paused, looking at it longer than she intended to, searching their faces for some clue about when everything had shifted. She reached out, turned the frame face down, and withdrew her hand. The action was gentle, not angry, protective. She began unbuttoning the dress slowly, one button, then another. Her fingers moved with care, as if rushing might break something further. Each small motion felt deliberate, final in a quiet way that left no room for argument. When the last button came free, her hands stilled. They shook once. The tears still didn't come. She folded the dress instead of hanging it, careful, even. She smoothed the fabric, aligning edges, pressing lightly where creases formed. The ritual felt strange, but necessary, like acknowledging the importance of something even when it could no longer be used. The box waited under the bed. Natalie placed the dress inside and closed the lid. The sound it made echoed softly in the room. She rested her hand on top of it for a moment, then slid it back out of sight. The house settled into quiet around her. Muffled footsteps moved down the hallway. Low voices drifted from the kitchen, hushed and cautious. Through the partially open door, Natalie could hear her parents talking without trying to hear what they were saying. She didn't want explanations or plans yet. She wanted the night to stay unresolved. Her phone buzzed. Once, then again. She glanced at the screen, then turned it face down on the nightstand without reading anything. The vibration continued briefly before stopping, as if the device itself eventually realized she wasn't going to respond. Contact felt impossible. She wasn't ready to accept sympathy or confusion or curiosity. Right now, silence felt safer. She changed into an oversized shirt borrowed from her old dresser and slid under the covers without turning on the lamp. The ceiling above her looked unfamiliar in the dark. despite being the same one she had stared at as a child. Shadows shifted slowly as passing cars moved outside, their lights briefly touching the walls before disappearing. Time stretched. Minutes passed without awareness. Her body remained stiff, alert, as if sleep were something she had forgotten how to reach. The events of the day replayed in fragments, not as a sequence, as moments. Richie's face, the sudden attention of strangers, the sound of the room changing, each fragment surfaced without resolution, leaving her mind restless, unfinished. She closed her eyes, then opened them again when nothing changed. Morning felt impossibly far away. Dawn eventually pressed pale light through the curtains. Natalie hadn't slept. Her body felt heavy, but her mind remained awake, aware, suspended between what had happened and what she hadn't yet allowed herself to understand. She sat up slowly, feet touching the floor, grounding herself in the room. The night was over. The aftermath had begun. The days that followed drifted without shape. Natalie moved through them quietly, performing tasks without awareness of when one ended and another began. Morning blended into afternoon before she realized she hadn't eaten. Evening arrived without her remembering how she spent the hours between sunrise and dusk. Her parents tried to maintain normal routines around her. Coffee brewed at the same time each day, the television turned on for background noise, but even those familiar patterns felt distant, as though she was watching life through glass. She nodded when spoken to, sat at the table when meals were served, but her presence felt borrowed. Nothing settled inside her. Time didn't feel fast or slow. It simply existed, and she stayed suspended somewhere in the middle of it. Mirrors became obstacles she avoided without thinking. She walked past them with her head turned slightly away. At first it was habit. Later it was intentional. She didn't want to confront the version of herself staring back, someone wearing the weight of an event she still hadn't processed. When she caught her reflection, accidentally she paused, then looked away immediately, not out of shame, not out of fear. It was something quieter. She wasn't ready to see herself as the woman whose life had shifted without warning. Her face looked unchanged, but her eyes were different. They carried a heaviness she didn't recognize yet, something unfinished, something she didn't know how to explain. So she kept walking. Public curiosity arrived quickly. People she hadn't spoken to in months sent messages, each beginning with concern and ending with questions she had no intention of answering. Some wanted information. Some wanted comfort. Some wanted entertainment disguised as sympathy. Her silence frustrated many. But silence was all she could offer. Privately, she felt something different, something slower, heavier. The grief wasn't sharp. It didn't overwhelm her in waves. It settled instead, occupying her thoughts quietly throughout the day. She didn't tell anyone how it felt. She didn't outline the moments that replayed in her mind. She kept the distance intact, guarding herself against the outside world's need to analyze a story that didn't belong to them. Curiosity faded when she didn't respond. Her grief stayed. She spent long afternoons on the bench outside the house. It faced a line of trees she had grown up with. As a child, she played beneath them. As a teenager, she read books there. Now she sat in silence, hands resting loosely in her lap, watching the branches shift with the wind. The bench became a place where her thoughts settled enough for her to breathe. Not deeply, not freely, just steadily. Sometimes her mother would glance out the window, checking that she was still there. She always was. The sunlight changed. Birds moved through the branches. Cars passed occasionally. Life continued around her, indifferent to the collapse she carried internally. She remained seated, letting the stillness hold her in place. Confusion lingered longer than anger ever could. She expected outrage to come at some point, but it didn't. Even when she tried to summon it, nothing surfaced. The emotion she felt was not rage, it was uncertainty. She couldn't decide where to place blame. She didn't know how to categorize what had happened. The pieces didn't fit neatly into a narrative she could stand behind. She knew Richie hadn't been unfaithful. She knew Georgiana had acted out of fear. But knowing wasn't the same as understanding. Anger requires clarity. Confusion doesn't. She remained in the latter. Her internal questions never formed fully. They surfaced as fragments, short thoughts that rose and disappeared before she could make sense of them. Why didn't he tell me sooner? When did she start feeling that desperate? Why did it have to happen that way? Was I the last to know, or was I the last to understand? Each question carried weight, but none stayed long enough to develop into conclusions. Natalie didn't seek answers yet. She wasn't ready to ask anyone directly. She wasn't sure she wanted explanations at all. Explanations required emotional energy she didn't have. Questions floated in and out of her thoughts. She let them. Her mother sat with her one evening, not close enough to intrude, but near enough that Natalie felt the presence without pressure. The sun was setting, casting long stretches of fading light across the lawn. Neither woman spoke at first. After a few minutes, her mother asked gently, "What hurts the most?" Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it again. She didn't know how to articulate it. Her mother didn't push. The quiet returned, softer this time. It was the first moment Natalie realized the pain she carried wasn't sharp, it was layered. It wasn't about dramatic discovery. It was about what she hadn't been given the chance to prepare for. She felt her chest tighten, not from grief, but from clarity trying to form. Late at night, when the house was still, she replayed the wedding in short, disconnected scenes. People standing, voices stopping mid-sentence, eyes turning toward her, everything shifting too quickly to process. She remembered the ring falling. She remembered Richie's expression. She remembered the cold air when the doors opened. She didn't remember walking out. Her mind had protected her from that part. The more she examined the moment, the more she understood that betrayal wasn't what shattered her. It was the realization that something important had been kept from her long before that day. She had been excluded from a truth that involved her life. She hadn't lost trust because of actions. Clarity arrived slowly. It didn't rush. It didn't announce itself. It came while she sat on her bed one morning, legs folded beneath her, staring at nothing in particular. Her thoughts held steady long enough for her to recognize something she hadn't been able to name before. Richie hadn't betrayed her body. He had betrayed her certainty. He had decided when she should hear the truth. He had decided which moments she deserved to be protected from. He had chosen silence in a place where transparency could have prevented everything that followed. It wasn't the kiss that damaged her. It was the withheld honesty. That understanding settled into her without drama. No anger, no outburst, just recognition, the kind that stays. Richie drove without direction. Streetlights passed in a steady pattern above him, but he barely registered where he was. The city looked different at that hour, quieter but not peaceful. Traffic lights changed obediently at empty intersections, telling him to stop and go even when no one else was on the road. He obeyed out of habit. His hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His jaw ached from how tightly he held it, even though no one could see his expression anymore. The wedding venue was far behind him, but his body hadn't caught up with that fact. His chest still felt tight, like he was standing in that room with all those eyes pinned to him. He turned left without thinking, then right, then followed a road he didn't recognize until the buildings grew sparse and the spaces between houses widened. He wasn't avoiding home exactly. He just wasn't ready to be surrounded by the evidence of the life he had been building. The suit jacket, the printed vows, the gifts waiting to be opened. He pressed the accelerator slightly harder, as if speed could separate him from the memory of Natalie's face when noise turned into silence. He replayed the moment over and over. Her eyes, her stillness, the ring leaving her hand. Every time he reached for a different version of events in his mind, he was forced back to the one immovable truth. He had withheld information from her, not out of cruelty, but the motive didn't soften the outcome. It was just motion. He finally pulled into an empty parking lot on the edge of town, where a closed gas station sat under a dull canopy light. The engine ticked softly when he turned it off, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. For the first time since leaving the venue, he let his head drop forward, forehead resting lightly against the steering wheel. His mind tried to reach for the same excuses it had offered itself weeks ago. It was a mistake. You handled it. There was no reason to hurt her with something that was already over. Those lines had felt like logic then. Now they felt thin. He pictured the small moment in his apartment when Georgiana had crossed a line, when he had pulled away immediately, voice firm, words clear. He had stood up for his boundary, ended it instantly, and told himself that action was enough. What he hadn't done was tell Natalie. He had told himself that omission was mercy. He stayed like that for a while, hands loose on his lap, shoulders slumped, eyes closed but far from sleep. He didn't cry. His body seemed past that, stuck in a state beyond tears where everything had moved from shock into a heavy, settled ache. Eventually he straightened, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out a pen he'd tossed there weeks before. A crumpled flyer lay in the side pocket of the door. He took it, turned it over, and began to write, not because he had decided what to say, but because he needed his thoughts somewhere other than his head. The first sentences came out in fragments. I should have told you. I was afraid of losing you. I thought I was protecting us. The more he wrote, the more obvious something became. Every justification he had clung to had one thing in common. They centered his comfort, not her autonomy. He kept writing anyway. By the time he reached home, the sky had lightened at the edges. The house greeted him with the same stillness it always had, but it no longer felt familiar. The walkway he had once imagined carrying Natalie over after their wedding now felt like a path to a place he didn't fully recognize. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The remnants of preparation were everywhere. Ribbon on the counter from a partially wrapped gift, a list on the fridge with last-minute tasks crossed out, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, waiting for a future that no longer existed in the same way. He walked past all of it and went straight to the kitchen table. The paper he'd written on in the car was worn from the pressure of his pen. He smoothed it out, then reached for a clean sheet. This time, he wrote as if he were speaking directly to her. He described exactly what had happened between him and Georgiana. No softening, no trimming, no convenient omissions. He admitted to the fear that had guided him, the calculations he had made without realizing he was tallying, trust like a currency he could manage alone. He didn't ask for forgiveness in the letter. He didn't argue for himself. He simply laid out the truth in the order it should have reached her, line after line. When his hand began to ache, he stopped, read it once, and felt something strange, relief and shame colliding in his chest. Relief because the truth was finally complete somewhere. Shame because it had taken disaster to bring it out. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the top drawer of the sideboard. He knew he wasn't going to deliver it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He had written it to confront himself, and that was the first honest act he'd managed since the kiss. The next day, he found himself driving toward Natalie's parents' neighborhood without making that choice consciously. He noticed the turn only after he'd taken it. His grip tightened on the wheel as houses began to look familiar. Mailboxes he had driven past hundreds of times blurred together. This street carried too many memories now. He slowed down as her parents' home came into view. The bench outside was visible from the road. He'd seen her sitting there before, long before the wedding, on evenings when she'd call him after a long day and say, "I'm on the bench. Are you free to talk?" Now the bench was empty. He didn't stop. He didn't park. He just looked as he rolled by. He imagined her sitting there anyway, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded in her lap. Not crying, just existing beside a life that had shifted without her consent. The thought pressed against his chest. He realized how different things could have been if he had chosen to walk up that path weeks ago, knocked on the door and said, "I need to tell you something that might hurt, but you deserve to hear it from me." He had chosen the opposite. He had chosen to keep her on the bench in the dark, unaware of a secret that involved her future. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, watching the house shrink behind him. He kept going. This wasn't the moment to appear at the door and ask to be heard. This was the moment to sit with what he had done. Waiting, he discovered, has its own sound. The refrigerator humming, the clock marking each second, footsteps from neighbors in the hallway outside. He noticed all of it because he had decided not to fill the silence with noise. He could have turned on the television. He could have played music. He could have scrolled endlessly through messages from people offering opinions wrapped as support. He chose none of that. He sat on the couch, phone on the table in front of him, screen dark, and let the stillness settle. Waiting this way didn't feel noble. It felt raw. He wanted to send a message that explained everything. He drafted multiple versions in his head. "You have to understand. If you'll just let me talk." Every imagined sentence came with one problem. Each one asked her to do something for him. Listen, forgive, believe, before he had done what was owed, so he didn't write them. He sent one short message instead, reminding her he was there when she decided what she needed, and left it at that. The rest of the waiting was his to carry. Days unfolded with a new kind of discipline. He went to work because he had to. He completed tasks, answered calls, attended meetings. His body moved through routines on autopilot. But his attention was shaped by something else now. Whenever his mind tried to rewrite the story in a way that cleared him, he forced himself to walk through events exactly as they happened. He didn't hurl accusations at himself. He didn't dramatize his guilt. He simply refused to edit. He saw Georgiana's face when she'd leaned in. He saw his own expression as he stepped back, firm and clear. He saw, just as clearly, the quiet moment afterward when he had made the choice not to tell Natalie. That moment, more than any other, held the weight. He recognized that he had acted from fear of losing the life he loved, not from confidence in the woman he loved. He had treated the relationship like something fragile that needed guarding from discomfort rather than trusting it to withstand a hard truth. The realization stung in a way accusation never could. Accusations can be argued with. This couldn't. He thought about the word protection differently now. He had used it like a shield. I didn't want to hurt her. Why cause pain when nothing actually happened? It sounded considerate on the surface, but when he stripped away the language, he saw what sat beneath it. He hadn't trusted her with reality. He had decided, on his own, how much of the truth she deserved. He had chosen to spare her the discomfort of knowing at the cost of her right to make decisions about her own life. That was not protection. It was control wrapped in concern. He stood in the kitchen one evening, hands resting against the counter, and said it out loud just once. I didn't protect her. I managed her. The words made his chest tighten, but he didn't look away from them, because until he acknowledged that, everything else would sound like performance. Accountability settled in quietly. It didn't arrive with a grand gesture or a speech. It showed up in smaller decisions. He stopped rehearsing what he would say if Natalie led him into a longer conversation. He stopped picturing himself as the central figure in her healing. He stopped imagining the moment she would thank him for being patient. Instead, he focused on something else, who he would be even if she never called. Would he tell the truth earlier next time, with anyone? Would he choose honesty before comfort, even when it risked losing what he wanted to keep? Would he trust the people he loved enough to let them walk away with full knowledge? Those questions shaped him more than any hope of reconciliation. He reached for the letter, in the drawer one night, unfolded it, and read it again. The words still felt true. They still felt incomplete, not because they didn't cover everything, but because they could never fully repay what had been lost. He folded it once more and put it back. If she ever asked to hear everything, he would speak without hiding anything. If she didn't, he would still live with the understanding that silence, chosen at the wrong moment, had turned his attempt at care into harm. And that lesson, whether it won her back or not, would stay with him long after the story stopped being discussed by anyone else. Georgiana learned very quickly what it meant to be alone in a crowded world. Her phone stayed face down most days, not because it was silent, but because she couldn't bear to hear it vibrate again. Messages came in waves, some angry, some confused, some coated in sympathy that felt heavier than blame. She didn't open most of them. Knowing what they said didn't change what she felt. Her apartment became smaller with each passing day. She stopped playing music, stopped keeping track of the time, stopped opening the windows. Even sunlight felt intrusive, like a reminder that life outside her walls hadn't adjusted itself to what she had done. Neighbors came and went, cars passed below, doors opened and closed. Inside she remained still. Isolation wasn't something she chose deliberately. It settled naturally once she realized she had nothing to say that didn't sound incomplete. Silence wrapped around her days, thick and suffocating, leaving her alone with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to confront before. Fear filled the space where logic used to live. At first, she replayed the events over and over, searching for moments she could reframe. If she examined everything closely enough, maybe she'd find a reason that explained what she'd said without making her face the harm it caused. But her mind no longer followed reasoned paths. Thoughts jumped sharply from one extreme to another. Shame surged, then retreated, only to be replaced by dread. Her heart raced unexpectedly. Her hands trembled while doing ordinary things, pouring water, unlocking doors, tying her shoes. Fear didn't let her slow down long enough to think properly. It whispered only one instruction: Don't let this get worse. But fear never explains how it decides what worse means. She thought often about the moment itself, standing there, surrounded by people, knowing she couldn't pull the words back once they left her mouth. At the time, it hadn't felt like a decision. It had felt like pressure breaking a weak point. Her chest had tightened, her vision blurred slightly, her body reacted before her mind had a chance to intervene. She hadn't paused to consider consequences. She hadn't weighed truth against impact. Panic had filled in the gaps where reflection should have been. Later, alone, she understood something she hadn't been ready to admit before. She hadn't spoken because she was confused. She had spoken because she was overwhelmed and afraid. That distinction mattered more than she wanted it to. Public responses arrived quickly. Strangers looked at her differently now, some with open judgment, others with uncomfortable sympathy. When she ventured outside, to buy groceries or check her mailbox, eyes lingered longer than usual. Conversations fell quiet when she passed. Pity settled around her like a second skin. People assumed she was fragile, broken by circumstances beyond her control. They didn't see what happened when she closed her door behind her. They didn't see her sitting on the floor at night, arms wrapped around herself, replaying every second and recognizing how much damage a few words could cause. They didn't hear the questions she asked herself when no one else was listening. Public pity softened her image. Private collapse hardened her reality. It was during one of those long, quiet nights that the weight finally broke through denial. She sat on the edge of her bed, breathing slowly, the room dim except for a small lamp in the corner. Her thoughts refused to scatter the way they had before. For the first time since the wedding, they stayed long enough for clarity to form. She had known, not guessed, not suspected. She had known the child was not Richie's. Fear had convinced her the timing justified silence earlier, and panic had convinced her the moment demanded speech later. Now she saw those choices for what they were. She hadn't been confused about the truth. She had been afraid of facing it alone. That realization settled in her chest and didn't move. Once she allowed herself that honesty, another truth followed closely behind. Her words hadn't just shocked a room. They had stolen something. Natalie hadn't been given a chance to process privately. She hadn't been allowed to ask questions, to breathe, to understand what was happening without an audience. Georgiana hadn't just spoken out of turn. She had taken away Natalie's right to learn the truth with dignity. That was the part that hurt the most to acknowledge, because it meant the damage wasn't accidental. It was structural. She stopped rehearsing explanations after that, stopped imagining conversations where she justified herself convincingly enough to lessen what she'd done. No version of the story softened under scrutiny. For the first time, she accepted that accountability wouldn't look like apology alone. It would look like facing facts she had tried to outrun. It would look like hearing confirmation she already knew was coming, and it would require her to stop hiding behind fear long enough to confront reality head on. That understanding didn't comfort her, but it steadied her, and for the first time since the wedding, she stopped resisting what she knew had to come next. The clinic did not feel important. That was what unsettled Georgiana the most. She had expected the place to carry some sense of gravity, something that reflected how much this moment mattered. Instead, it looked like any other medical office. Neutral walls, simple chairs, a check-in desk with forms stacked neatly beside a pen attached by a thin cord. This was where truths were confirmed every day. No one whispered, no one slowed their movements, no one looked at her as if they understood why her hands trembled when she held her identification. She signed her name carefully, pressing harder than necessary, and took a seat along the wall. The chairs were arranged with space between them, close enough to acknowledge others but far enough to keep everyone separate. The air was clean and still, too still. Time moved differently inside the waiting room. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. Each small sound stood out, the polite clearing of a throat, the shuffle of paperwork, the soft opening and closing of doors down the hall. Georgiana folded her hands over her stomach without thinking, then loosened her grip when she realized she was pressing too hard. She focused on breathing evenly, counting the seconds in and out the way a counselor once suggested during moments of overwhelm. She already knew the truth. That was the part she couldn't escape. This appointment wasn't discovery, it was confirmation, and confirmation carried a different kind of weight, because once something was documented, it no longer allowed denial to operate quietly in the background. When her name was called, she stood too quickly and had to steady herself. The nurse's voice was calm, professional, practiced. Georgiana followed her down the hallway, noticing the way her shoes sounded against the floor. The room they entered was bright, clean, functional. No softness, no ceremony. Questions came first. Dates, timelines, medical history. Georgiana answered without hesitation. She had rehearsed these facts in her head countless times, but saying them aloud still felt like exposing something fragile to bright light. When it was over, the nurse left briefly. Returning with paperwork, she explained in the same, neutral tone she used for every patient. The words were clear. There was no ambiguity. Richie was not the father. Not now, not ever. The confirmation didn't bring relief. It hollowed something out instead. Georgiana stared at the paper longer than necessary, letting the reality settle into her body. She had braced herself for anxiety, for panic, for collapse. What arrived instead was grief, not because the result surprised her, but because it removed the last place fear could hide. She had destroyed something important without uncertainty as an excuse. Now there was only responsibility. She sat alone in her car for a long time afterward. The engine remained off. Her forehead rested against the steering wheel, eyes closed, breathing shallow but steady. Tears came quietly, no sobbing, no dramatic release, just steady drops that slid down her face and disappeared into the fabric of her sleeves. This moment didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the words spoken at the wedding. It didn't return Natalie's choice or repair the damage already done. It only confirmed the shape of the consequences. She whispered once, barely audible, "I knew." Saying it out loud stripped it of power. The truth no longer needed to be defended from her own fear. Calling Richie felt necessary, not comforting. She waited until her breathing steadied, then reached for her phone. Her fingers hesitated over his name, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she understood that this conversation would shift something permanently. When he answered, she didn't waste time. "I went to the clinic," she said. She heard the pause on his end. "It's confirmed," she continued. "The baby isn't yours. It never was." There was no anger in his voice when he replied. No relief either. That simple acknowledgement unsettled her more than accusation would have. "I needed it confirmed," she said. "Before I said anything else, before I spoke to her." A breath passed between them. "You need to tell her," Richie said. "Not because it will help you, because it's the truth." "I'm scared," she admitted. "Fear already spoke once," Richie said. "Don't let it speak for you again." The words landed heavily. They didn't excuse her. They didn't comfort her. They clarified the moment she was standing in. After the call ended, Georgiana sat in silence again, realization settling fully now. This confirmation wasn't a turning point in the story. It was a line drawn that could not be crossed backward. Truth didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with obligation. And for the first time since the wedding, she understood that facing what came next wasn't about redemption. It was about finally allowing honesty to replace fear, no matter who it disappointed. The information did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small remarks passed along without intention, fragments that floated toward Natalie from different directions. A comment from a distant cousin, a brief message from someone who hadn't spoken to her since the wedding, a sentence that ended too carefully, as if the sender wasn't sure what could safely be said anymore. Nothing was direct. That was what unsettled her. She noticed patterns first, references to appointments, hints that something had been confirmed, people speaking as if they now knew more than she did, but weren't confident they had the right to explain it. Natalie didn't respond to any of it. She had learned that second-hand truth often arrives distorted, shaped by the person carrying it rather than the facts themselves. She didn't want the information filtered through sympathy or speculation. She waited. Waiting felt different now than it had before. Before, waiting had been passive. Now it was deliberate. When Georgiana's name appeared on her phone, Natalie didn't feel panic. She felt prepared. The message arrived without announcement. No voice message, no request to talk first, just words laid out plainly, without urgency or apology built into the opening. Natalie sat down before opening it, as if her body already knew this was something she should meet without distraction. She placed the phone flat in her hand and exhaled slowly. She read the first line, then the next. The message did not ask for forgiveness. It did not appeal to history or shared memories. It did not defend or soften. It stated facts, dates, timelines, certainty. It acknowledged fear, it acknowledged responsibility, and it acknowledged directly that the child was not Richie's and never had been. Natalie read the entire message once without reacting. Her face remained calm, her breathing steady. She noticed this with quiet surprise. There was no rush of emotion, no immediate relief, no flare of anger trying to push forward, just a stillness that felt different from the numbness she had carried before. This stillness was grounded. She read the message again, slower this time, letting sentences settle where they landed, without judging her response to them. She recognized something important as she reread certain lines. The truth did not feel gentle, but it felt solid. Uncertainty had hollowed her out from the inside. It had left too much space for imagination to fill in gaps she couldn't control. Now those gaps were closing. Clarity came with edges, but it didn't drift. She placed the phone down on the table beside her and rested her hands on her knees. Her chest tightened briefly, then released. For the first time since the wedding, her body wasn't bracing for what might come next. She didn't cry, not because the information didn't matter, but because it mattered in a way that finally made sense. The pain she felt now was specific. It had boundaries. It didn't stretch endlessly into unknown territory. Natalie realized slowly that clarity, even when it hurt, asked less of her than uncertainty ever had. Uncertainty had demanded vigilance. Clarity demanded honesty. She could handle honesty. She sat with the knowledge quietly, allowing herself time she hadn't been given before. There was no audience, no pressure to respond immediately, no eyes watching for reaction. This time, the truth belonged to her alone. Later that evening, she sent a short reply. No emotion packed into it, no verdict implied. "I've read it," she wrote. "I need time to process. We'll talk." She stared at the message once it was sent, noticing that her hands were steady. That detail mattered. It told her something about where she stood. The decision forming inside her wasn't about repair. It wasn't about blame. It was about facing what had happened directly, without intermediaries or assumptions speaking on her behalf again. She didn't want more information passed to her secondhand. If conversations were going to happen, they would happen with her present. The thought settled quietly without urgency. She would meet them, not to collapse into anything unresolved. She would meet them to complete something that had been left open too long. Natalie understood now that avoiding the conversation would preserve comfort but delay closure, and she was no longer willing to carry a story that ended everywhere except where it mattered most. She picked up her phone once more and checked the calendar. Not to rush, just to choose. The uncertainty was gone. The truth did not arrive in a straight line. It reached Natalie unevenly, carried by other people's discomfort rather than her own readiness. A conversation that ended abruptly when she entered her room. A sentence that stopped halfway through when someone realized they didn't know what she already knew. Familiar names mentioned with sudden awkwardness, as if everyone else had been handed a memo she missed. She noticed it in the pauses, the way people hesitated before speaking, the careful softness layered into ordinary questions, the restrained concern that followed her everywhere without explanation. Natalie didn't chase the information. She had learned that when people circulate partial knowledge, urgency creates confusion instead of understanding. This felt different from the wedding night. Then, silence had trapped her. Now it felt like something was approaching slowly, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She let it wait. Clarity gained shape through fragments. Someone mentioned appointments during a conversation that had nothing to do with her. Another person referenced paperwork without context, immediately changing the subject as if they'd stepped too close to something private. Natalie absorbed each fragment without reaction. There was a time when not knowing would have sent her spiraling inward, pulling her attention in every direction at once. That urgency was gone now. In its place lived something steadier. She didn't feel desperate for answers. She felt ready for them. The difference surprised her. She realized that uncertainty had exhausted her more than any truth could. The waiting, the guessing, the constant background noise of unanswered questions had drained her in ways she hadn't recognized until now. Whatever was coming, she would meet it awake. The message arrived late in the evening, just Georgiana's name on the screen. Natalie sat down before opening it, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment. She rested her elbows on the table, phone cradled lightly in her hands, and inhaled slowly. She read the message from beginning to end without interruption. No dramatic opening, No attempt to soften the words, just information laid out carefully, facts expressed cleanly without pressure or demand. Natalie noticed the absence of explanation first. Georgiana did not justify herself. She did not argue for understanding. She did not attach emotion to facts that stood clearly on their own. That restraint mattered more than any apology would have. Natalie didn't react. Her face remained calm. Her body was still. Nothing surged or collapsed inside her. She simply continued reading until the final line, then set the phone down beside her. The room stayed quiet. She waited for the response she assumed would follow: shock, anger, grief, but it didn't rush in. Instead, she felt something settle. The information carried weight, but it held shape. It didn't spread endlessly through her thoughts or press against her chest the way uncertainty had. She understood then that fear had done more damage than truth ever could. Not because truth was gentle, but because it was complete. She reread the message more slowly. This time she let each sentence land fully, observing how it affected her breath, her posture, the tension in her shoulders. The pain was present, but contained. It had edges. Uncertainty had none. Natalie recognized the shift clearly. Clarity hurt, but it asked less of her. It didn't require vigilance. It didn't demand constant emotional preparedness for surprise. It allowed stillness. She sat with that realization until it felt solid enough to trust. Clarity didn't restore anything. It didn't erase what had happened, but it returned ownership of the story to her, and that mattered. She responded simply. "I've read it," she wrote. "I need space to process. We will talk." There was no accusation in the words, no promise either. She placed the phone face down and leaned back, eyes closing briefly as she centered herself. Her thoughts moved slowly now, no longer colliding. Natalie noticed something significant. Her hands weren't shaking. That detail stayed with her. After everything she had endured, her body recognized this moment as contained, serious but survivable. That awareness changed how she viewed what came next. Later that night, she made a decision without urgency or resistance. She would meet them, not to reopen wounds, not to demand comfort, not to search for an outcome. She would meet them because clarity deserved completion, not avoidance. Natalie understood now that the pain she feared wasn't in the conversation ahead. It had lived in the absence of truth. Facing them meant closing a chapter that had remained unfinished too long. She opened her calendar and selected a day, choosing it carefully, deliberately. This time, no one would speak for her. This time, the truth would be witnessed by the person it mattered to most, and she was ready. Natalie arrived first. The lake was calm, its surface steady enough to reflect the pale sky above without distortion. She stood near the edge for a moment before turning around, grounding herself in the firmness of the earth beneath her shoes. She didn't come to be soothed by the setting. She came because open space felt appropriate for a conversation that required honesty without interruption. She had chosen this place carefully. There were no spectators here, no walls to close in on the truth, nothing for words to bounce off and return louder than intended. When she heard footsteps behind her, she didn't turn right away. She took one last breath, slow and deliberate, then faced them. Richie stood slightly to one side. Georgiana a few steps farther back. Distance already existed. Natalie didn't rush to close it. She looked at Georgiana first, not with hostility, not with softness, with clarity. "I read your message," Natalie said evenly, every word. Georgiana nodded, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered but not hidden. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to anticipate where the conversation might go. Natalie continued, her voice steady. "What you said confirmed what I needed to know," she said. "But it didn't undo the way I found out. And that part matters." Georgiana's shoulders tightened slightly. "I believed we shared our lives honestly," Natalie went on, "especially when the truth was uncomfortable. What happened took that from me." She paused, not for effect, but because the words carried weight. "You spoke in a moment when fear was loud," Natalie said, "but the result was that my choice was taken away. Naming it out loud felt different. It no longer trembled inside her." Georgiana lifted her eyes. "I know," she said quietly, "and I won't argue with how you felt. I can't fix what I took." Natalie listened without softening her stance. "I'm not here to make you feel better," Natalie replied. I'm here because I won't carry anger forward just to prove a point. She let the sentence rest between them. I forgive you, she said finally, not to restore anything that was, but so I don't remain tied to it. Georgiana exhaled, breath shaking slightly, but she didn't move closer. She didn't reach out. I understand, she said. That matters, Natalie replied, more than apologies ever could. Forgiveness passed between them quietly, without ceremony, and it stopped there. Natalie turned to Richie next. This part carried a different weight. I believed you when you said you never crossed that line, she said. That wasn't the hurt. Richie held her gaze, shoulders squared, no defensiveness in his posture. You decided when I should know the truth, Natalie continued. You decided what kind of pain I could handle. He nodded once. Yes, that choice changed everything, Natalie said. Not the act, the decision. I was afraid, Richie said, of losing you, of ruining what we were building. I know, Natalie replied. And intention doesn't erase impact. She let the words exist unsoftened. You weren't protecting me, she said. You were protecting the version of us that hadn't been tested yet. Richie swallowed. That's true. Owning it didn't repair the damage, but it honored it. Trust and protection aren't the same thing, Natalie said. Trust gives someone the truth and lets them decide what to do with it. Protection decides for them. She looked from one to the other. I won't move forward in a life where decisions are made on my behalf, she said. Not again. Neither pleaded. They understood the boundary being drawn. It wasn't punishment. It was clarity. Natalie stepped back slightly, creating space rather than distance. I'm not leaving this conversation angry, she said. And I'm not walking away unresolved. She gestured subtly to the lake behind her. I came here so the truth could exist without being crowded, she said. And now it does. I forgive, she repeated. But forgiveness doesn't require reunion. Richie nodded. I won't push past what you've said. Thank you, Natalie replied. For hearing that acknowledgement mattered more than promises would have. The conversation ended without dramatic closure. No embraces followed. No guarantees were spoken. Natalie waited until both had turned away before facing the water again. She felt lighter, not because the outcome was gentle, but because it was truthful. The lake remained undisturbed, no surface broken, no ripples demanding attention. Natalie breathed in deeply, then turned and walked back toward her car without looking behind her. She wasn't retreating. She was reclaiming agency over her story, and this time, no one would speak for her again. Life did not reset once the conversation ended. Natalie returned to ordinary mornings without announcement or transition. She woke up at familiar hours, went to work, and answered questions with polite neutrality. There were no explanations offered, and none required. The absence of drama felt intentional now. She had learned that moving forward didn't require ceremonies or statements. It required steadiness, showing up for a life she was actively choosing rather than defending. Her days filled themselves quietly. At home, Natalie made small changes. Not a full overhaul, not an emotional purge. She moved furniture slightly, creating new walkways in rooms she'd walked the same way for years. She donated clothes she no longer reached for. She cleared drawers she'd avoided opening. Each decision felt deliberate but unforced. This wasn't erasure, it was reorientation. The wedding box remained. Natalie carried it from the back of the closet to a higher shelf where it was visible but not central. She didn't open it again. She didn't need to. Its presence no longer felt accusatory. It was a reminder, not of loss, but of context. A chapter that existed, mattered, and ended without defining the rest of her life. She placed it where it belonged and didn't look back. Richie honored the space she had claimed. He didn't show up unexpectedly. He didn't send updates meant to draw sympathy. He didn't interpret silence as invitation. When they spoke, it was brief and clear. Respect replaced expectation. Waiting wasn't something he performed publicly. It became something he practiced privately. A daily decision not to cross lines simply because he once had access to them. Georgiana moved away, not dramatically, not in search of redemption. It was practical, necessary. A way to live where her history didn't lead every interaction. She settled into a new routine that required consistency, not explanations. The distance didn't erase responsibility, it made it visible. Accountability showed up in ordinary moments, in telling the truth early, In choosing not to reshape stories for comfort, for each of them it became less about what had happened and more about how they would live with it. Mistakes no longer demanded performance, they demanded adjustment. There was no reunion waiting in the distance, just three lives moving forward separately, shaped by the same event but no longer bound by it. What remained wasn't bitterness or nostalgia, it was understanding, and for the first time in a long while, that felt enough. Natalie noticed the change in small ways first, not in grand feelings or sudden happiness, but in how she occupied space. She stood differently now, not guarded, not performative, simply present. The constant sense of being evaluated, by others or by herself, had loosened its grip. She no longer replayed conversations after they ended, wondering how they sounded or what they meant to someone else. What mattered had already been decided, and that certainty followed her quietly through the day. The mirror caught her attention one morning. She hadn't been avoiding it anymore, but she also hadn't used it as a point of reflection beyond routine. This time she paused. Her face looked familiar again, not unchanged, but aligned. There was no searching in her expression now, no bracing. Her eyes met their own without resistance, without expectation. Natalie didn't ask herself whether she looked stronger. She simply observed that she felt complete. She left the house and walked without destination. No phone in hand, no urgency in her steps. The sidewalk stretched ahead, ordinary and unremarkable, and she followed it with ease she hadn't felt in months. Passing strangers glanced at her, then moved on. That anonymity felt relieving. She wasn't carrying a narrative anymore. She wasn't explaining herself silently to people who didn't ask. For the first time since everything changed, she was moving forward without needing permission to do so. Natalie realized then that truth had shifted something fundamental. It hadn't restored relationships or rewritten outcomes, but it had returned authorship. No one was speaking on her behalf now. No one was managing information to control consequences. The story of her life no longer lived in delay or omission. Power had returned to where it belonged, not in certainty about others, but in trust in herself. That trust felt steady, unshakable. She walked past familiar places without tension. The cafe where she had once rehearsed a future that never arrived. The store where plans used to feel permanent. Each place existed now as a point in time, not a trap. Natalie didn't need to confront or avoid any of it. Memory no longer dictated movement. She chose her direction freely. There was no announcement when the shift completed itself. No realization spoken out loud. No emotional punctuation to mark the moment. Just a calm understanding she carried with her as she turned onto a different street and kept walking. Natalie hadn't lost herself in what happened. She had found herself when it ended. And that, more than restoration or reunion, was the victory she would keep. Natalie returned to the lake alone, not because she needed confirmation, and not because she was searching for meaning. She came because the place no longer carried weight the way it once had. It had become neutral ground again, open, quiet, unchanged. The path toward the water felt familiar under her feet, but it didn't pull at her memories. She walked at an unhurried pace, hands loose at her sides, aware of the air moving around her without interpreting it. This time, she wasn't arriving to confront anything. She was simply present. She stopped a few steps from the water's edge. The surface reflected the sky with steady calm, uninterrupted by movement or expectation. Natalie stood there without folding her arms, without bracing herself, without scanning the space behind her. No one was supposed to arrive. She wasn't early. She wasn't late. There was nothing she was waiting to hear or see. No conversation scheduled. No words rehearsed in advance. The absence of anticipation felt deliberate. She let her attention rest fully on the moment. The sound of her breathing, the firmness of the ground beneath her shoes, the quiet certainty of being where she chose to be. Before, standing here had meant holding her breath, wondering how the conversation would end, what answers might arrive, what version of herself would walk away. Now there were no questions forming. The lake did not ask her for anything, and she did not need it to. Natalie realized something then. She was no longer explaining her absence to anyone, no longer imagining how others might interpret her choices, no longer pausing her own movement to account for reactions that might never come. She had stopped placing her life on hold for clarity. Clarity had already arrived, and it had done its work quietly. Standing there, she understood that control hadn't returned in a dramatic moment. It had returned gradually, through decisions made without witnesses. She turned away from the water without hesitation. There was no backward glance, no lingering thought left unfinished. The path behind her was just a path now, one option among many, not a symbol demanding closure. Natalie stepped forward easily, letting her body set the direction before her mind tried to complicate it. Movement felt natural again, not reactive, not symbolic, simply chosen. As she walked away, Natalie carried no sense of finality. No endings announced themselves, no lessons needed to be spoken aloud. The story did not resolve into clarity for everyone, only for her, and that was enough. She continued forward without seeking permission, without marking the moment, without waiting for the past to release her. Nothing was holding her now. The lake remained behind her, unchanged. Natalie didn't look back. This story was never about a wedding that didn't happen. It wasn't about a kiss. It wasn't about a pregnancy. It was about what occurs when truth is delayed long enough to do damage, and how easily fear can replace courage when the moment to speak feels inconvenient. Silence has a reputation for being careful. It often looks gentle from the outside. It feels protective in the moment, but silence chosen to avoid discomfort doesn't stay neutral for long. When it replaces honesty, it begins to decide outcomes without consent. That's where harm begins. Courage, in contrast, rarely feels graceful. It shows up awkwardly. It risks loss. This story reminds us that courage spoken earlier might have changed everything, but courage spoken later still mattered. Forgiveness appears often misunderstood. Forgiving does not restore what was broken. It does not require closeness. It does not cancel consequence. Forgiveness here simply ended the harm's reach forward. That distinction makes all the difference. Reconciliation is something else entirely. It requires mutual rebuilding, shared effort, and aligned futures. Natalie chose forgiveness without reconciliation, not out of bitterness, but out of respect for who she had become. That choice wasn't cold, it was deliberate. Healing in this story did not arrive as reunion, it arrived as ownership. Ownership of truth, ownership of movement, ownership of deciding when enough is enough. Choice, not closure, became the turning point. If this story resonated, it may be because many lives are shaped not by betrayal itself, but by what is withheld in the name of protection. It may remind you of moments where silence lingered too long, or when clarity returned control you didn't realize had been taken. Those moments matter. Some stories don't restore the past, they return the future. If this story stayed with you, like and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime for more stories about truth, choice, accountability, and emotional resilience. Your support helps keep these stories coming.